Hello, everyone. This is the Revolutionary Think Tank podcast. This is episode 28. And if this is the first time you're tuning in, this is a podcast about political commentary, protest music, and revolutionary thinking. My name is 4AS, and this is my co-host, Myster E. So, Myster E, how are you going today?
I am very well, 4IS. How are you?
Yeah, I'm going pretty well today. And bit of a controversial one today.
Yes. Controversial, I think, for any of those hardcore lefties in the audience. Not so much for the revolutionaries out there, but I think this is a topic that a lot of people on the left find hard to come to terms with. Let's just be honest. And that topic is and it's a question I think that's been asked a number of times over the last 100 years now, but like still pertinent as ever as we transition through different phases of leftism, if we
Hmm.
can call it that. Is Lenin really a socialist? Is he really a communist? I think it's undoubted,
Hmm.
or it's not really needed to debate whether or not he's revolutionary.
Yeah.
Um, But whether or not he's communist, whether or not he's actually like a socialist, I
Hmm.
think that is the real question at hand. And I think it's important to have this conversation. I
Yeah.
do, because I think that people often just conflate socialism slash communism with revolution. Like the two are the
Hmm.
same. And I don't think that you can conflate those two things. Revolution is not socialism slash
Hmm.
communism or vice versa. They are mutually exclusive. That doesn't mean they don't exist
Hmm.
in the same space, but they're not the same thing.
I would actually take it a step further and say that people conflate socialism and communism with specifically Leninism. Now,
Yes. Okay.
and for those people who don't know about Leninism, is
Mm.
probably where our critique is going to come into today. So that
Yeah.
was the process of what Stalin was doing, what Lenin was doing, what Trotsky was doing at 1917, which was the revolution in terms of you having a vanguard party and that vanguard party, leading the people to rise up against the establishment. But specifically, what it is that the political party or the vanguard party is the one that kind of takes control of the state and then establishes themselves, seizes the means of production, establishes the vanguard party as the party that's in control, and then later down the track, once it has educated the people with what it means to actually seize the means of production, what basically that there's a successful transition into socialism where the capitalists have been expelled, you're actually controlling the factories and all of that, and then once you get to the stage of being a much more commune society, that's when it hands the means of production over to the people.
Mm.
Now,
Mm.
the $1 million question of today, though, is well, you can say that Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin seized them into production in terms of being the vanguard party, being the Communist Party in Russia. But did they actually did they actually give it over to the people? Did they do
Mm.
the final step of Leninism?
Yeah.
And more importantly,
Yeah.
what happened to the Soviets?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think they're all quite relevant questions to to try and grapple with the bigger conversation here is whether or not you can equate Leninism with any of the socialist communist kind of principles, especially in the terms of how they progress. Maybe not the end goal. I think you could align Leninism and communism slash socialism as having the same end goal, but the path of getting there is completely at question here and definitely worth debating. But I think before we get into kind of
Hmm.
that discussion, we need to talk some fundamentals for maybe people in the audience that aren't exactly across what we're talking about here. So socialism, I think, for me, and I think this rings true for a lot of people that have studied socialism and have a good enough understanding of what it is.
Mm.
Socialism really is just two things, and that's it. Everything else is an extrapolation of that slash an interpretation of that slash built on top of these two principles. This is it. And you mentioned it a number of times there. Socialism is seizing the means of production. And seizing the means of production in the case of socialism, as opposed to capitalism, because that's just what it is. It's a response to capitalism, is instead of some private entity owning the means of production, it's owned by the workers. So the people that, let's say, the classic example, that work in a factory, they own the factory, like kind of thing. They seize or they control the means of producing, and that is divvied up amongst all of the workers themselves. That is
Yeah.
socialism at its most basic and fundamental level. The other principle of socialism, which I think is undisputed, as well as that thing I just mentioned then,
Mm.
is that socialism is a step on the way to communism. Socialism isn't an end in itself. It is the way to get to this ultimate kind of communist way of living. So those are the two things you're grappling with here. And so once you consider what Lenin did, and people that would consider themselves Leninists or would follow Leninism, that was a very specific way of getting to some form of revolutionary society.
Mm.
So, does it align with those two principles that I just described there? That's the real question. So we need to, I think, discuss what Leninism is. Like you've broached it there for us, for
Mm.
us. You've talked about Vanguardism and the idea of
Yes.
the Vanguard Party. So a group of professional revolutionaries that sit at the head of the revolutionary movement and spearhead that insurrection or that takeover, that coup, that revolutionary momentum that is driven by the people. And they were very strong on these people being the workers of the world and the workers of Russia and stuff at the time. But the people that spearhead this movement, those professional revolutionaries, they were the ones that became that centralized political organization that became the one party state that controlled Russia after the October
Mm.
Revolution, which we
Yes.
call, the, what is it? I think that it's officially called the Soviet Party. No, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
That's the one party state that eventuated as a result of the October Revolution and having a vanguard party and a
Mm.
group of professional revolutionaries that lead the charge. But like they ended up taking over control in an autocratic fashion. And also their autocracy led to, you know, pretty extreme authoritarianism.
Mm.
Now, whether you think that's justified or not, that's a separate discussion, but let's just call things what they are, in essence. So
Mm.
I think that's one big part of Leninism, which you've discussed there. But the other part of Leninism, which is, is a big part of his writings, and it's a massive justification for, like, I think everything he does, is that Leninism is let's say, a step or a progression of Marxism.
Mm.
And Marxists kind of interpret Marx's work and look for kind of lessons or things that he left kind of undescribed but hinted to. And one of these main concepts that Lenin picks up and discusses a lot is the dictatorship of the proletariat, like kind of thing. So
Yeah.
the dictatorship of the proletariat is kind of this fundamental idea that Marx kind of grappled with, and Lenin definitely grapples with, and kind of, I think, justifies his entire raison d'etre for his revolutionary activity,
Mm,
being that in order for the workers to lead to communist society, you can't just take an anarchist's approach, which would be kind of, dissolve the state and like try and just make everything work without a state
mm,
apparatus.
yeah.
The state is very important in Leninism. It's the apparatus that must be grappled with and won from the bourgeois and the capitalist class, and then manipulated and used by the revolutionary workers to deliver communism. And the dictatorship of the workers is, the workers using the state, controlling the
Mm,
state, and oppressing, I guess, all the other classes, is supposed to be just a transitional or momentary period on the
mm.
way to something much more civilized and communistic.
Yes, because really, with what Lenin pretty much ended up with, which was the Vanguard Party being in charge and the Communist Party in Russia being in control, the huge, I guess, plot point with all of this happening was the Soviets, because really, if you look at any of the literature around that time, like let's take for example Leon Trotsky's like memoirs and also his histories of the Russian revolutions, you see whether it's the April days, the July days, the like pretty much everything that was leading up to the October Revolution.
Yeah,
There was a lot of vacillations in the sense of, you know, the uh, the Mensheviks being in power, or the Bolsheviks being in power, or
mm,
the Bolsheviks having to be in hiding because they the Mensheviks would align themselves with another group and force
yeah,
them into hiding. But really, the reason why Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, the Vanguard Party came out on top was they had aligned themselves with the Soviets, which were basically um, councils. They
yeah,
were the irony of it ended up being authoritarian, or at least a state control. It was
yeah.
actually these kind of councils that were very bottom up that helped. They had aligned themselves with the party, or the Vanguard Party had aligned themselves with these Soviet councils, and they were the ones collectively that seized the means of production.
Mm.
And
And they were grassroots organizations of workers.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
incredible, isn't it? Like they were really democratic in their origin and like in their essence. They were collections of workers, sectioned off into, I guess, different factions, based on whatever industry or union they were part of, and they came together in different, I guess, geographies or locales around Russia, especially obviously the industrial parts of Russia, though they did spill out into the rural areas, obviously, as things progressed. But yeah, the Soviets were these very organic grassroots democratic organizations, that especially in the 1905 revolution that happened kind of in this like
Mm,
this rise to the ultimate October Revolution. They were integral in that kind of
mm,
fever that happened in the early turn of the century in Russia, and then kickstarted kind of the workers' movement, or really made it a force to be reckoned with. Because, like, I think the provisional government at the time had to kind of reason with them a lot and make concessions to have them
mm.
included in parts of the process, because they were just this awesome machine. And like people just took matters into their own hands, basically. They got
Yeah.
together, like the workers of Russia didn't wait to, have politicians speak on their behalf and all this type of stuff. They just got together and made decisions, and they worked as a political function, kind of side by side with the actual political establishment that was made up by, I guess, representatives from the bourgeois. classes and the capitalist classes and the nobility of Russia. So the Soviets were, yeah, very integral to kind of the whole concept of Leninism, in the sense that I think Lenin was using the popular kind of support and public opinion for socialism, which is definitely represented in the Soviets, right? Because they're
Mm,
collections of workers looking to seize the means of production. And you kind of piggyback that fever, that passion that's already instilled in the people, and they're already working in kind of these very, very important groupings already, and they have political standing, and you piggyback on top of that enthusiasm and you ride that wave and you sell this to the people. You say, okay, this is what Marx would have wanted. Marx would have wanted a dictatorship of the proletariat, so all of the working class, the conscious working class components that are ready to kind of, I guess, inherit the capitalist world and take that from them, overthrow them. But like, not only do they need to take over, but they also need to form a class that sits above everybody else and dictates to them how society will be run moving forward. And so I think Lenin was a very smart politician,
yeah.
and he was able to gather that sentiment for kind of working people's political autonomy and desires for political freedom and expression in Tsarist Russia, and
Mm,
like turn that into a justification as, okay, well, this is what Marx said, so let's deliver what Marx would have wanted. But he's interpreted that, I think,
mm,
and you can see it in his work. Like, it's riddled throughout State and Revolution, it's riddled
yes.
in the April Theses,
Yeah.
and many of his letters and correspondence in Pravada, and all of the stuff that he's writing for, 10, 15 years almost, while he's in exile and in different parts of Europe and what have you, kind of, trying to massage the Bolsheviks and like the social democratic workers' parties and stuff like that, trying to get them onto his side and thinking about his agenda. But now we've kind of covered the context of what was happening in Russia and what type of
Mm.
wave he was riding, and we've talked a bit about socialism and Leninism. The question then has to be asked now, is Lenin a socialist? And was what happened as a result of Leninism socialism slash communism? So,
Well, well, the let's let's have a zero sum game in the sense of, well, it was designed to be that the Vanguard Party would take control, and then eventually, when things settled down, that everyone understood how things were going to work, they would therefore give it over to the people, the means of production.
yeah.
And the thing was that just didn't happen.
And that's the
So
important point, right? It's not like when the Russian Revolution happened, the October Revolution happened, the Soviets ran in there, or um, like the Soviet Party on their behalf, the Communist Party on behalf of the people went in and took everything and gave it over to organizations of workers, right? They didn't
yeah, yeah,
seize the means of production and hand it over to the workers, did they? That's not what
no.
happened.
No, and look, let's even do a generous interpretation of the situation. Is that okay? You can turn around and possibly blame Stalin because he decided to go off and maybe create a more authoritarian regime. Like, you could make that interpretation, but even if you put all of the blame and scapegoat Stalin, you would eventually have to turn around and say, well, Leninism and this style of a socialist regime, then it has to be incredibly flawed because it basically creates a philosopher king scenario. And
Okay.
what I mean, but
Yeah,
what I'm,
please
yeah,
explain that.
what I mean by that is that's actually going back to Plato's Republic, and
Okay.
he likes to talk a lot about what makes a moral and just society, and he always uses the philosopher king as an example. But the
Yep.
interesting thing about the philosopher king is it's somebody who is incredibly moral, incredibly wise, incredibly important, and it's almost a person that's a proxy. Like it's somebody that you could never possibly be. And I guess why I'm using that term is that, well, you're kind of assuming that all of the actors within that sort of state structure are
Mm.
always going to be moral, always going to
So you're talking
be,
about like the benevolent ruler, like just
yeah,
somewhat,
pretty
okay,
much.
like a
Yeah,
benevolent and just ruler. They're just a
yeah,
good person, but they've got the power to veto and have executive decisions on everything.
yeah.
Right,
And
right.
I guess even in a generous interpretation, you would have to turn around and be like, well, wasn't that situation at least primed to be exploited? Because you're assuming that those in power would be willing to give up power that easily.
Yes, yes. And as the old adage goes, absolute
Absolute
power
power corrupts
corrupts
absolute.
absolutely. So you can, and so this is the case that like I think I have heard people make, and like let's go right back to the beginning of our conversation, which is rather controversial for people on the left, and for people that have had to try to reconcile for a long time now leftist ideology and socialist kind of like socialist ideology, and tried to reconcile that with the actions of the Soviet Party and the Soviet Union from its inception through to I don't know when the Berlin Wall fell. Um, it's been very difficult for people to do that, I think, because it's hard to try and marry up a a dictatorship of the proletariat, which basically results in a centralized party and a group with complete control over everything that happens, and then instill a version of totalitarianism or authoritarianism within the society that they're trying to uphold and protect. But then they never let go of it, like which is what you're talking about, like that concept of once the power's there and in their hands, when were they going to make that shift and start to devolve their powers back into the Soviets and into democratic kind of bodies and organizations and give it back to the people, which was always the end game, right?
It's effectively it's a Julius Caesar scenario, or a case of putting the state in martial law, but then just never coming
Yeah,
out
never
of martial law.
withdrawing from that,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, at all. And I think that is the state of or the siege mentality that the Soviet Union went into, and for whatever reason they never came out of that again because they were always, you know, on the defensive and having to fight against, the West and capitalism and all that sort of stuff. So they
Mm,
always had this kind of, like they were under attack, and so they had to preserve themselves at all costs. And so you have someone like Trotsky who talks about permanent revolution, and then you have someone like Stalin who doubles down on protecting and
mm,
preserving communism slash socialism within the nation at all costs before you could ever spread it. And this is another concept I think that is not as fundamental as those two principles I talked about before, but I think it's almost as important, and most socialists would agree to this, I hope. Socialism is internationalism.
mm,
And so socialism means and recognizes the fact that the working class, or let's just say all the working people of the world, have no borders. So
mm,
the working class transcends borders. It is an entity that is not nationalized or contained within certain geographies. It like all the working people of the world have the same interests and are oppressed by the same classes. It's an it's a what's the word? It's false to think that your working interests as a working class in one country any different to someone in a neighboring country or someone on the other side of the world. There's no validity to that. You're all in the same struggle and you're all being oppressed by the same class. Because let me tell you, the capitalist classes and the ultra rich, they don't conform to any particular nationality, and they will move their money and their assets around the world globally to tax dodge and do whatever they need to stay in power and have their interests upheld. So the working class should not have to conform to any borders. But look, I just went off on a tangent there, but but socialism is an international movement. And so the idea of Leninism as it developed right after the revolution, I would say, was really about doubling down
Mm.
on centralizing power in Russia and really kind of, I guess, eliminating any potential threats to the Bolshevik party and Bolshevik power to one kind of stop any type of counter-revolutionary movement that was going to happen. So like they got rid of any political opposition because that might be the way in for counter-revolution or a counter-insurgency. So, you get rid of political opposition that way and for that purpose. But then they close themselves off from the international workers'
Mm.
movement quite heavily. I think there was, potential for some stuff going on in Germany, and like they had to split themselves from that. And stay away from that because, especially around like when they first started off and the First World War was still
Mm.
raging on, they had to make some pretty big concessions there too. Lenin was no idiot.
Yeah.
Which people didn't like at the time, but he conceded parts of Russia to Germany to get peace between the Germans and the Russians in World War One. And people
Mm.
didn't like that. I know a lot of the workers kind of parties and organizations at that time wouldn't have liked just like getting rid of swathes of Russia at the time to placate the Germans to try and get some type of peace going on. But like that's the type of stuff that he had to do to try and preserve Russia. So
Mm.
a lot of the actions that Lenin took and Leninism developed were pro-Russian, not pro-socialist. They're not out of a socialist playbook. Let me just say it like that. They're
Yeah, and
about
I
preserving
yeah.
the Russian state. Sorry.
Yeah. No, all I was going to make was a little side note that we're not even getting into Catalonia and I guess the disillusionment of George Orwell's. But
Yeah, it's
yeah.
interesting. Yeah, because I did a bit of reading on the when you're talking about Catalonia, you for those that we're talking about the Spanish Civil War and
Mm.
Franco and the anarchist revolution there, and which Orwell was part of. He was a
Mm.
libertarian socialist and went to join the anarchist uprising there. And like it's funny because when you read things from the anarchist perspective about what happened in the Spanish Civil War, they're very critical of like Stalin's Soviet Union at that point, the Stalinists and the communists from Russia, because they're not getting the help that they thought they would get from them
Mm.
at all. And like they do believe that ultimately, while, you know, Franco was being supported by Hitler and Mussolini and stuff like that, and I guess you could say the Western allies, like, your France's, your Great Britain's and your Americas didn't really want like the spread of Nazi Germany and fascism through Europe. They were probably more comfortable with fascism than they were with real socialist anarchist movement. And the communists of Russia, the Soviet Union, were the same. They didn't really trust a real socialist revolution like an anarchist one. And so the Soviet Party didn't do a lot of things they could have to help the anarchists in Spain, which is something the anarchists are very pissed off about. And they write a lot about how like when they asked for weapons and funding and support, it didn't come when they needed it. It came afterwards. And if there were decisions to be made about what to concentrate on in terms of attacking Franco's forces and all that sort of stuff, the Soviet communists were very different to what the Spanish communists slash anarchists wanted to do. So, like at that point in
Yeah.
Stalinist kind of Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union at that point was very much an imperial entity because it had to preserve its own interests, and its interests were that were aligned with the West. And so the
Yeah.
West wanted to do things. The Soviets had an agreement and an alliance with them because they were trying to stop the spread of fascism. And so they had kind of a joint kind of what's the word, interest there, a shared
Yes.
interest.
And this is kind of the reason why I bring it up, because really the legacy of Leninism is fundamentally the building blocks of the reason why people criticize socialism and communism. And what I mean by that is two things. One, um, state authoritarianism, and that people that are against these sort of ideas are saying like, oh, look what happened at Russia. Russia fell. Therefore, none anything that's in relation to that is completely false, or it just completely doesn't work.
Yeah, yeah.
I've actually showed even on my channel how those kind of ideas are complete fallacies, but that's a bit of a
Mm,
side note. And then number two is
mm,
basically everything that you were talking about with the Catalonian situation, the left eating itself.
mm,
That's
mm.
the other the major criticism that people make of socialism or communism or any sort of leftist ideal is that, well, you guys just like to fight amongst yourselves, and that you don't actually focus on the issues that are hand at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And that all stems from the legacy of Leninism, because that sort of breakdown starts with the dismantling of the Soviets after the October Revolution, and it rears its ugly head every now and again, whether that's the situation in Catalonia, whether it's whether it's, I guess, Lenin dying and Stalin taking over, whether that's the eventual fall of the Soviet Union, and
Mm, mm.
I guess the alternative to capitalism eventually die.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think it's a really good point what you're making about the fact that, and this is what I was trying to say before as well, is that it's been really hard for leftists, like 100 years after Lenin, to kind of justify socialist ideology because of the impacts of Leninism.
Hmm.
Leninism, I think, is separate, and it should be separated from socialism, communism, and like general leftist ideology, because general leftist ideology was forged in radical democratic enthusiasm. Like the original kind of left, if you want to take it back to somewhere and point where did the left kind of come from, you can kind of go back to the French Revolution, even though there's some justification kind of before that potentially. But let's go back to the French Revolution and like the tennis court oath, when the I guess the third estate met and they decided that they were going to take things into their own hands, and not have to deal with the oppression of the nobility and the clergy. And so you had those kind of radical Democrats that were on the left of the tennis court. And then you had the kind of more, I guess you would say, conservative, but still looking for revolutionary change to a certain extent. Third estate members, basically the bourgeois, on the
Hmm.
right-hand side. And so leftism has always been about some form of radical democracy, or
Hmm.
ensuring that the political process is guided by the hand of democracy. And so what Leninism does, or what Leninism kind of eventuated in, was a complete degradation of democratic institutions. We talked before, the Soviets were dwindled away and basically lost all of their actual original meaning. like the Soviets still existed because it was a Soviet Union, but like a union of what?
Mm.
Like the parties that were just basically run by the one communist party, who were basically controlled by a small group of people anyway.
Mm.
No democracy going on there. Like Lenin, to a certain extent, when like they kind of went full like into overdrive with the suppression of opposition political parties in the Soviet Union at one point, even outlawed kind of factions within the Communist Party
Mm.
itself because they didn't want that rivalry happening. So if you think leftism or the left and socialism is about democracy, because that's, socialism is about bringing democracy to the workplace. If you think of it like that, then Leninism is anti-leftist. It's anti-democratic in a way because it puts a lot of emphasis on having a vanguard party, so a group of specialized people like technocrats almost, who are given power and the authority to do whatever they must to bring about the socialist revolution. And as we touched on before, if you give people ultimate power, like at what point do they hand it over? Like, is there ever a good time? There's always that question when you're doing anything. When's the best time to do something? But is there ever really the best time? Sometimes you just have to do it. So there's always going to be a question mark on when the power will be handed back to the people so they can live themselves democratically. So Leninism has been very responsible, I think, for confusion on the left because people want to support. I think leftists naturally want to support anything that calls itself socialist/communist because
Mm.
they're trying to bring about change. They're trying to do something different. They're trying to oppose capitalism, which at essence is modern day leftism ever since, kind of socialism began. It was established as being the antithesis of capitalism. So like anyone that tries to kind of instill that and put that into practice, you naturally as a leftist want to get behind it and support it. And so people have always tried to defend it, but like, is it defendable? And I think that's what we're grappling with here today. Is Leninism really defendable in a socialist context? In a revolutionary context, no question.
Mm.
That man, Lenin, is one of the finest revolutionaries in human history.
Yeah.
But whether or not he's a fine socialist, I would argue not. And like I've even had it put to me, or even I've heard people discuss it, that the Bolshevik revolution was actually a right-wing coup. It was a right-wing takeover.
Okay.
If you think about it, they were the radical faction of I think it's the Social Democratic Labour Party. Anyway, they were the faction that split from the Mensheviks, and the Mensheviks were
Yeah.
kind of this broader, kind of leftist organization that had, different political party or different
Mm.
political opinions within the party and more democratic. And the Bolsheviks were kind of, thanks to Lenin, very keen on the Vanguard Party doing all of the work and controlling everything, and then taking power and leading the people in the charge to bring about socialism. They were not about democracy, and they were all about autocracy, making sure that they had absolute control over everything. That, to me, or if you think about it just black and white, don't think about the context of what was going on, but just think about it like that. If you take something over, you overthrow, which at the time was the provisional government, so
Mm.
an elected government, if you overthrow an elected government and instill a one-party regime that has all power over everything and leads to a form of authoritarianism,
Mm.
by today's standards, you would call that a right-wing coup.
Yes, because it's what I guess maybe what you're driving at is the idea of, well, you have a group of people that I guess overthrow a government.
An elected
Um,
government.
yes, and really, uh, I guess if you have the backing of the Soviets, that I guess can be seen as an army of sorts. Um,
Well, yeah, because the Soviets sit outside the political organization. Like we said, they were a political organization to themselves, but they weren't the
mm,
status quo kind of political organization that was in the country. They weren't elected through official means. They were outside of the system, running alongside it, don't get me wrong,
mm, mm,
and very democratic. But like you could say that they were insurrectional in themselves because they were looking to displace the actual government of the time. And they were militant, like you were saying. So they're almost
mm,
in the same way organized like a private army. Now, let me just caveat all of what I just said by 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 noting, and that's why I said you got to look at it black and white, very black and white without context, but noting like fully well that Russia at the time and Lenin slash the Bolsheviks when they came into power were in one astonishingly immense predicament.
mm,
Like Russia was completely screwed at that point. They were poor, they were getting absolutely hammered in the war. Like they had people defecting all over the place. They had a battle going on with the Japanese all the way to their east. They had stuff going on all the way to the west. They were just absolutely ravished. Like they just had nothing going for them at the time. And the for the Bolsheviks and Lenin to kind of take power in the way that they did against all the odds, and then they tried to hold it together somehow amongst all of that carnage that was going on, is, the stuff of legend. Like, don't get me wrong. And they tried to achieve some incredible things, and they did achieve some incredible things. Like holding
mm,
power at that point was just absolutely incredible. And like what happened following that, there was reactionary wars that happened in after World War One even,
mm,
and the Americans got involved. Like the West didn't leave Russia alone after World War One kind of thing. They might have allied with them in World War Two to help them get rid of Hitler, but like before that, they were waging war with them
mm,
to try and make sure that no one else in the Western Hemisphere got the idea to start some type of socialist revolution. They had to stamp that stuff out straight away. And so they faced some astonishing and prodigious threats, both internally and externally, to, the Russian way of life and just their own existence
mm,
generally. And so they were dealing with a lot. Don't get me wrong. And so I do think that their actions were justifiable. They were definitely justifiable in the face of all those stark odds. But
mm.
is it socialism? No.
No, and that's kind of the reason why I used the phrase martial law before,
Mm.
because you kind of needed to have all hands on deck at that time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because yeah, like again, that's the reason why I was talking about Lenin Trotsky's history of the Russian Revolution, because things were happening left, right, and center in terms of somebody being in power, somebody else being in power, and really somebody had to eventually end up on top, which the Bolsheviks
Yeah.
did, and
Yeah.
actually establish some sort of normacy.
Yeah,
Although,
some type of attack plan, some type of plan of action, how we're going to do this. And I think they did that very well. And I think like they did try to instill some very important leftist ideals and some very important socialist principles. But like they never achieved it. And for like all of you, and like that's why was I very intently gave that spiel just then about recognizing the context of what they're going through, because a lot of people will just like outright say, well, the ends justify the means. Okay. And so it doesn't matter what you do in the lead up to the eventual communist society as long as you get there. But like, let's look at the ends. Like, they never got to communism.
Mm.
And like it led them to a form of totalitarianism. Whether you think it's justifiable or not, it was still a form of totalitarianism and a form of authoritarianism that was very hardcore and isolating. And like, what have we got now? We had the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of, well, I don't even know what you would call Russia right now, but it's like
Well,
very intense capitalistic mogul kind of, what are they? Like the
they're,
people that,
bas- they're basically feudal oligarchs.
yeah, it's a very, very rigid and stratified kind of system that they have there, in terms of like a form of capitalism. Like you said, I guess it's just oligarchic, extreme oligarchic form of capitalism. And so, like, okay, you might have had to do a lot of things to try and sustain the Soviet Union and get to a certain point, but like, no, you can't use the argument, I think, the ends justify the means, because this is the ends right now. We're experiencing it here because it wasn't communism that it ended up being. It's kind of this very dog eat dog world style of capitalism that happens in Russia. And it's like, culminating with a what is it? He's a lifelong leader now, isn't he? Putin. He's set it up
Mm.
in the in the way that he will, you know, continue to rule over Russia for as long as he can remain in power, I guess you would say.
Mm.
So it's just gone from one form of regime to another, and it's even more concentrated now, I guess you would say. So, like, you can't even use the argument. All I'm just trying to say is you can't even use the argument the ends justify the means, because we know how that worked out.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can use that argument, I think. I think you can try and say that, okay, well, you can do some questionable things now because we know what the result is going to be, and so it'll balance out in the end. But it didn't balance out here. It
Yeah.
didn't work out the way they
No.
intended it to. And like, who knows, if Lenin didn't get sick and survived, like, maybe things would have been different. Maybe he was legit. Like, some of
Yeah.
his writings in the lead up to the October Revolution are incredible. Like, he goes, the questions, what should be done? Like, those kind of seminal kind of leftist steps in the lead up to the Russian Revolution, like inspiring socialist works that had like the whole of Europe sitting on the edge of its seat. Like, he's asking the big questions, he's coming up with answers and stuff, like, answers to the question of democracy, answers about what needs to be done next for the revolutionary cause, and debating people over the ideas of reform and revolution. Like, this stuff, like, it it is kind of um, idealized now as like the pinnacle almost of socialist rhetoric and discussion in this time leading up to when they really take power. And like, some of his work is just so good, like the way he writes, and the quotes that he comes up with. Like,
Mm.
he's an incredible writer, an incredible orator apparently. Like, I can't speak Russian, so like, I've seen him talk, but I don't know how 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 good it is, because I can't understand what he's talking about. But you know, like, the translations of his writings are incredible, and he was prolific as well with his writing. And it's either two things for me. He was a socialist and he was trying to get to socialism, and this is the way that he really thought it was going to happen, and this is how it was going to be done. You needed just a party just to take control, take the bull by the horns, and just get what needs to be done. Doesn't matter how much blood you get in your hands, just make it happen.
Mm.
Or he was a politician and he wanted power, and he knew that socialism was popular with the people, and he needed to get access to a party, so he got access to the Bolsheviks, which were lending themselves to more of an authoritarian kind of takeover and leadership style. And so he really was a right-wing kind of person, but he just rode a wave of popular support for socialism and used that as his way of convincing people that this is the way that we were going to do things in Russia. So it's either he really just wanted power, he was a power-hungry narcissist who just used socialism to justify what he was ultimately going to do, was just to take power at all costs, or he really was a socialist, but like,
Well, yeah, that's honestly the biggest what if of history with this story is that if Lenin survived, what would have happened?
yeah,
Because that's the reason why I said in a charitable interpretation of this, and you put all the blame on Stalin.
mm,
You have to eventually turn back if you're a supporter of Leninism and say, well, okay, Stalin may have stuffed this up, but it therefore you have to admit that this system is flawed because it opened itself up to
yeah, relying,
being under
yeah,
martial law and martial law never ending.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting concept. And like the even I guess after Lenin, then and I know we're breaching into a different territory here. We might even have to discuss this in a different podcast. But like the question has to be asked about, okay, did Lenin really plan for his demise or his ending, the final chapters that he was going to partake with in the Soviet Union? Did he plan for that? Did he have a backup? Because there's like this famed legendary story about like the struggle, I guess you would say, between Trotsky and Stalin and who was going to take power. But like we've talked about this before,
Mm.
um, and it's not as like, you know, legendary kind of thing as people make it out to be. It wasn't this struggle for power because Lenin's just left this void. It was not like that at all. Lenin had picked a successor,
Mm.
and a lot of people don't recognize that, or slash maybe they don't want to admit that.
Yeah.
And we know who this successor really was. I guess we can extrapolate from what was going on at the time who the successor was, and like it was Stalin.
Mm.
It wasn't
I-
Trotsky, because it was Stalin who was 2IC. He
yes.
was second in charge.
Mm.
Yeah. Trotsky, I think, was in charge of maybe the army or something at that point, which don't get me wrong, high ranking kind of station. But Lenin's right hand man, his secretary or whatever the official position was Stalin. It was Stalin that was actually there at the time of Lenin's, I guess, his final days.
Yes, and this might be referring back to what you were saying before, but you know, Trotsky does mention quite a bit in his histories that Stalin, throughout everything that's leading up to the October Revolution, Stalin was very much part of the right wing faction of the Bolshevik Party.
Interesting. And because, yeah, Trotsky doesn't come on board until very late in the piece. I think it's like
Correct.
literally like a few days before the revolution, before they can really convince him to come over.
Yeah, he was umming
Pretty
and
sure
ahhing.
it's, yeah, for
No,
ages.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because he doesn't like the Bolsheviks for most of like from 1905 right up until almost October. I'm pretty sure he's just like, you guys are mental. Like, you can't run a socialist organization like this. And so you really have to think then if, you know, Stalin is his 2IC and Trotsky doesn't get involved until right before the actual October Revolution, like we're pondering about what would have happened with Lenin and what type of person Lenin was. Was he an imposter that was riding a socialist wave, or was he really socialist who kind of use the ends to justify the means? But if you think about it like that, that Stalin was always there with him, and Stalin himself was kind of the right wing of the Bolshevik faction,
Mm.
and Trotsky was kind of the outsider and was never really to succeed him. then I think we can actually extrapolate then what Lenin's trajectory was. And it is right wing, or the right wing of the Bolsheviks.
Mm.
And it is for a Stalinist approach to things, not Trotsky's kind of approach to things, which is that idea of internationalism and permanent revolution.
Yes.
Stalin doubles down on the let's protect the motherland and let's get socialism going here and then spread it out to the world when we're ready. But like, if you really look at how Marxists kind of think about the world, and socialists, not just Marxists, but like socialists that are contemporaneous with Marx, is
Mm.
that socialism was always an international movement, and you can't beat, like Marx would have said this, and I'm sure I've read stuff of his about this. You cannot beat capitalism in one country or in one area. The socialist revolution must be the ultimate takeover of capitalism in all of its forms. Because if you don't destroy the dominant ideology, it is strong enough and it will come back. It will
Yes.
come back and it will overtake. So you can have small wins here and there, but like unless you go straight for the jugular and take out the entire capitalist system at large, which is international, you
Yeah.
can't
Yeah.
just take over in a couple of countries. Unless you do that, you're never going to have any success.
Well, it's kind of the reason, and maybe this is the final note that we can kind of end on, is I think that's the reason why the word anti-capitalist is so powerful. Because the thing is that when you're too focused on one set of ideas or at least one way of doing things, you end up kind of preaching to the choir and you don't take on different strategies of how to do things.
Mm.
Whereas when you have such a broad church with anti capitalism and all the various different types of grassroots ways of doing things, then you can actually see how different methods actually work, and
Mm.
you can chop and change them and find out what's best to kind of lead people in a democratic way.
Yes, yes. And to respond to the situation at hand. Because
Yeah.
I think that is a good kind of understanding or a good way of looking at the ultimate struggle. The ultimate struggle shouldn't come down to an ism, like, like being a particular brand of socialism or being an outright communism or a particular um, yeah, a particular sectarian version of something. It should be part of a broader struggle, which is there's capitalism and there's the antithesis of that. And so if everything that's the antithesis of capitalism comes under that broad umbrella, that broad church that you're talking about, and like there should be, and this is a massive leftist principle right here, if you had to write the 10 commandments of being lefty, solidarity is absolutely essential. And so everything that is on the antithesis of capitalism in that spectrum, then you need to have solidarity among those movements and all of those various sections on that spectrum. And not only solidarity, but like you need to understand that there's many ways of skinning a cat, and there might be many approaches that need to be taken in order to battle that machine. And as we've talked about before, it's not just like the bloodthirsty kind of dictatorship of the proletariat style that is envisaged by Leninism, where it's just like working people of the world, grab your gun. We've got a war to fight against the capitalist classes and the imperialist overlords. It could be done from the grassroots level, which is
Mm.
what you're always banging on about with your cooperatives, which I
Yes.
think are a very revolutionary element and ultimately, kind of the the basis of real anti-capitalism, because it goes to capitalism at the economic level. It hits it right at the heart. Like,
Mm.
because you have capitalism as an economic entity, but you also have capitalism as a political entity. But like capitalism really in essence is economic. It's commerce driven. So if you can hit it at its core, drive the stake right through the heart of capitalism, it'd be at the cooperative level and
Mm.
changing the way that capitalism is done at its roots. So yeah, look, Leninism, for all of you out there that were wondering before listening to this, I don't think it's socialist at all. Revolutionary, but it's not socialist. It might have been a step towards communism in some potential stretch of the imagination and some type of really long kind of game plan to try and get there, but we'll never know. But I don't think it's fair to call it that, because it's very hard for leftists today to try and sit there and cop flack from right-wing commentators and just, let's not even say, we're not even right-wing, just centrist kind of douchebags that sit there and throw mud at us lefties slash revolutionaries and say, well, you know, like this failed and this was crap for this reason and that reason and stuff like that. And they sling mud and they use this as a justification as to why it should never happen again. I think that's wrong, and they shouldn't be allowed to call upon this as a reason, unequivocally, why socialism slash communism will never work. It's not a good argument, and I think it puts us 2 steps behind in our struggles.
Yeah, and to be honest, I kind of feel like that's a good sentiment to end on. So with that, just a couple of final points. I'm sure I've been banging on about it for a while now. Myster E and myself are going to be performing in Red Alert 2023. So that's going to be the 6th of May this year at the Argencourt Hotel. That's the new venue. So you can buy your tickets at Surveillance Party. And yeah, with that, we'll call this podcast episode to a close. Remember, everyone, to keep thinking and keep learning, and to sign us off, I'll give it to you, Mr. A.
Thank you very much, 4S. And to all of you out there, please remember, I am, you are, we are a mystery.